Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 3rd of May. Today we have a brief video just covering the latest developments around Novomykhailivka, Avdiivka, Chasiv Yar, and Kyslivka. We're going to start off by looking at some unconfirmed reports from Novomykhailivka. So recently, past 24 hours, there has been more chatters regarding this part of the front line becoming active again after we saw, I guess you could say now it's been a week and a half since we saw any sort of sizable changes. And a week and a half ago, that is when the Russian forces, they completed their final push to expel the Ukrainian forces from the westernmost parts of Novomykhailivka. And then in the subsequent days, they spent a lot of effort trying to clear out any sort of remaining presence in these dachas located to the north. And during that time period, the Russian garrison, which consists especially of the 155th Marine Brigade, and also some reinforcements that were moved in from other parts of the front line, like the 57th Motorized Rifle Brigade that was moved in from Chasiv Yar fronts. And they had a period of rest and recuperation after a really drawn out battle of 7 months. And now Russian sources are beginning to mention that they are putting pressure on the current line of contact southeast of Konstantinivka. And so I'll show you that vector of attack. And although this is not verified, I would say, even if it's not happening in the future, this is a vector of attack the Russians should be looking into, because you could see that south of Konstantinivka, there aren't many prepared Ukrainian defenses. It's also an area that's based around a ridge. All of this area that I'm marking in the red rectangle, give or take, is on this hill that is basically overlooking the chain of towns that the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to and the various roads that connect them together. And that chain of towns basically includes the road that starts in Novomykhailivka and then makes its way through Paraskovivka and then into Konstantinivka. Konstantinivka is, again, on a valley, so are all these other villages that are just almost parallel to it, you could say. And so the Russian forces, they definitely would want to flank it from the south to reduce the amount of casualties they would take by advancing along one particular road with all of their armored columns, but also because they would be able to overlook the village in the process. And at the same time, there is some information of Russian forces trying to attack towards Paraskovivka, but there isn't any sort of concrete territorial change that can make to the map. So for now, the Ukrainians, their 79th Air Assault Brigade, and some of the reinforcements that were moved in over the past 2 months are still holding in that village. In terms of reinforcements, you have another air assault unit that was moved in. You have, of course, drone support from the Shadow Drone Group. And then you have some additional reinforcements from the 116th TDF Brigade. And they actually fought around Avdiivka's northern flank about half a year ago, and now they've been moved to this part of the front. Looking at the area south of Pervomaiske, we do have an important update. After about a week of uncertainty, we now do have confirmation that the Russian forces did actually advance south of the E50 highway. And now we know the extent of that advance. It's about 1.6 kilometers southwards. And in the process, they took over various Ukrainian fields and trenches. You could see that the Russians are in the process of clearing them out. And this was verified by a video that was posted by the Ukrainian side showing their shelling of Russian forward echelons as they were entering these various orchards that were previously under Ukrainian control, and some videos of Ukrainian drones dropping grenades onto those Russian soldiers. And so now we know that the Russian infantry in this region, they are trying to clear out and squeeze out whatever Ukrainian remnants are left in this pocket. And you could see that it is currently a very narrow area. The front line around here is fluid. There isn't a very strong connection between any sort of Ukrainian infantry squads that may be in this bulge located further east and the ones that are located within some of these fortifications that are further west. And there is even a question about whether there even are Ukrainian troops left in this salient area. Either way, the Russian forces are now making efforts to clear out this region, which will shorten the front line. It will also give the Russian forces an increased buffer around Donetsk city and the various roads that extend out of it towards an area like Pisky, Pervomaiske, Vodiane. The Donetsk Ring Road, for instance, will be under less Ukrainian direct sight and fire, for instance. And in the process, the Russian forces will be able to basically secure control over Novelske, because we did get confirmation of Russian presence in southern Novelske, but there is still a question mark regarding these warehouses in the northern part of that hamlet. All in all, the Russian efforts south of Pervomaiske are important for the bigger picture, because although a lot of these areas are fields, they are on rather high elevation in comparison to some of the surrounding areas. And so this area is generally on a ridge, this red rectangle. It overlooks the next natural Ukrainian fallback line, because you can see that past the current salient that the Russians are in the process of taking, there is this, you could say, makeshift line that the Ukrainians set up because they anticipated that eventually their salient would collapse and they don't want to completely abandon the line of contact. But you can see that it's still in its nascent stage and that's not well connected, and that there aren't any sort of like houses or basements that could be used as cover. And so it will be difficult to hold it. The next natural line of defense is 7, or depending on where you're measuring from, 10 kilometers westwards along the Vovcha River. That's definitely a stronger line just based on the fact that you have these massive villages that are all well connected, albeit they are on a valley that will be overlooked by Russian positions on the ridge located to the east. And that's the significance of the Russian forces advancing through that direction at the current moment, taking over positions that were previously held by the 59th Motorized Brigade. Another longer term consequence would be regarding Krasnohorivka. If the Battle of Krasnohorivka is still ongoing at that point, and definitely the Russian forces would have an opportunity to flank any sort of Ukrainian garrison that's still located in the central northern parts of that town, and also any sort of Ukrainian presence in these trenches located just to the west of the line of contact. And of course, the Russian forces would be able to fire upon the supply lines leading to Krasnohorivka, which you can see there aren't many paved roads that are directly leading into it. There's just one from the Vovcha River area, and then actually does connect to it. And besides that, it's mainly just these open fields. Again, they're not being exposed to heavier and heavier Russian fire. Looking at Ocheretyne, on the 1st of May, the Russian forces, or this is actually reported by Deep State, but it is verified by them, and the Russian forces advanced further to the northwest of Ocheretyne. In the process, they took control of these 2 trench lines and cut off the road that is supposed to be basically connecting Novomykhailivka to the Ukrainian garrison in Arkhangelsk, which at the moment, it's really, the situation is dubious over there. We'll get to it in a second. Well, this means that the Russian forces are continuing to capitalize upon this sort of, it's not really a salient because it's definitely going to continue expanding, and the Russian forces are not under severe pressure on their flanks. They're continuing to capitalize based off of this advance, and especially in the northern direction. We also see some movement in the western direction with the Ukrainian forces retreating from some positions located along the road that connects the rail line to Novomykhailivka. The Russian forces will be looking to sever that connection and eventually use that road to assault Novomykhailivka itself and take over that key village. And again, we've explained why. It gives you the road that leads into the entrance to the T0504 highway that then connects to Pokrovsk and the various other Ukrainian logistical hubs in the region. And so, of course, Novomykhailivka is important. Ukrainian forces are trying to hold on to that village and defend it. And further south, you have the 47th Mechanized Brigade engaged in very heavy clashes to hold back Russian forces from entering Sokil from the northern flank, from the direct entrance to the east. So far, Russian forces have not entered Sokil. And looking again at this northern vector, the Russian forces are definitely aware of the fact that there's just this massive ridge that runs in between Arkhangelsk and Novomykhailivka, and it just continues expanding north. It's like this ridge, it's basically within this entire red rectangle, and the Russian forces are trying to take advantage of that, trying to advance through this open area where there is lighter Ukrainian resistance, take it over in order to, of course, overlook Novomykhailivka and various other villages to the west, but also to the east, to overlook Arkhangelsk or whatever's left of it, to overlook Kalinova in particular, and we'll explain why right now. Because also in the same update by Deep State on the 1st of May, they claim that the Russian forces were able to take much of the village, you could say about half of it, due to a vector of assault originating in Keramik. And so it would be in this northwestern direction and then advancing through the residential portions of the village. Now, this is disputed by some sources that claim that the assault by the Russians actually occurred the other way around, and that the Russian forces were assaulting from this position to the northwest of Ocheretyne, that they were able to take over this key stronghold in western Arkhangelsk, and then take over much of the southern portion of the village. And the claim by these other sources is that this area over here is still in a gray zone, and that you have some sort of like four Ukrainian echelons that are trying to retreat from this stronghold in between Novomykhailivka and Ocheretyne, and some of the other fields and trenches around here. And so we don't know which account of events is true, because there's still no geolocations. Really, the geolocations in this region, they take a day or two before they are on pace with the actual frontline changes. And we could also see that based on the deep state reporting, the Russian forces are beginning to get control of this particular tree line running to the north of Arkhangelsk, showing that the Russian forces do not just intend to occupy this village, but do have an intention to continue pushing north to Kalinove. If you look at the elevation, and I'll mark it here, these red lines, they symbolize a local hill that basically overlooks Kalinove. Kalinove is basically right next to a pond. It's on low elevation. So are various other villages around here, like Novomykhailivka, and a lot of these villages are basically comprised of Ukraine's next defensive line in this region, and you can see how it forms around these yellow lines that are connecting together. A lot of them have not been connected together yet, but in this area you do see more connectivity than in other parts of the Donbass line for the Ukrainians, and so the Russians want to continue with their momentum and prevent the Ukrainians from basically solidifying a line and reducing the tempo of the Russian advances. One way to do that is by putting pressure directly to the south along this ridge, attacking Kalinove, and then using the vector to the west to also flank Kalinove and overlook it from an even higher elevation standpoint. And that's something that would basically eliminate any sort of utility that these strong points over here in this X had for the Ukrainians, and then give the Russian forces a new vector of attack along Kalinove to continue advancing to the northeast and continue to undermine the Ukrainian defensive fortifications that were built up, including the ones that were built up along the H20 highway, which, although we haven't seen much movement around here, I keep on emphasizing it. This is a very important area for the Ukrainians to defend, because definitely Russians would want to send armored assets along this highway, and that includes trying to overrun this stronghold, which is basically in its own bubble, but it is a very strong position by the looks of it. And then you see like Alexandropol to the east. That's also a very strong position for the Ukrainians, located on a height. Definitely has to be taken by the Russians in their broader plan of securing control of the western flank of New York. And that's why I'm saying all of these Russian operations around Arkhangelsk are meant in the longer term to overrun and eliminate any sort of Ukrainian resistance that is located to the west of New York, open up the roads, open up the flanks, open up the high ground, then assault that village and squeeze it out in a way that would reduce Russia's casualties and take it over in a faster amount of time. Additionally, Arkhangelsk just generally does give this sort of like glue to connect the Russian breakthrough in this region, because you have these two different nodes of Russian attack that are not exactly connected at ground zero. They're of course connected by various local roads that are on Krasnohorovka, Stepove, Berdichi, but for a more immediate connection, Arkhangelsk would be important between the vector in Ocheretyne and around Keramik. And so by that point, you'd have a more unified Russian front line looking something like this. Another effect of the Russian advances is in regards to their artillery placement. And so we know that in recent days, the Russian forces have upticked their strikes that are going on, you could say 20, 30 kilometers away from the front, especially along the highway leading to Pokrovsk, trying to target various Ukrainian logistical centers. And so there was a strike, for instance, on ammo trucks recently that was published by these Russian reconnaissance drones, because now you have a lot of coordination between that artillery on the front line and the Orlan 10s or their various variants, Orlan 30s, etc. And so what we see now is that due to this Russian push on Ocheretyne you do have the Ukrainians moving back their counter battery fire. Any sort of guns that they do have to their disposal are being focused on trying to target Russian frontline echelons and less so on counter battery fire. And even so, the range of those guns will not be able to reach a lot of the current Russian artillery batteries that are stationed further south around Avdiivka, and that is due to the Russian advances that are located further north around Ocheretyne that have really given the Russians a very large buffer zone to place their artillery. And that means that over time, the Russian crews will be able to move their guns closer and closer and closer to the line of contact. Right now, I'd say that you do have some of those batteries located in Avdiivka. I haven't seen really any of them moved further north to like areas in near Ocheretyne, although that will definitely happen in the future because it is a great position on higher elevation overlooking various valleys where the Russians will eventually be able to place their artillery. For now, it's still in like northern Avdiivka, which is still good in the sense that it is some areas 9 kilometers away from the line of contact, other areas like 13, 14 kilometers away. But what you see is that now it's about 23, 24 kilometers away from this key highway, from the ring road, where you do have a lot of the intersections along this highway to basically split off into different paths into Donbass for the Ukrainian logistics. Further westwards, you do have Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk itself that are 33, 34 kilometers away on the eastern entrance in those outskirts. And that's only if we're assuming that the Russians are putting their artillery over 10 kilometers away from the line of contact, which is not always true. Sometimes the Russian forces could afford to move it even closer. And so, under such conditions, the Russian forces can now afford to target these key logistical hubs for the Ukrainians using some of their, for instance, howitzers that are specifically field artillery, such as the 152 millimeter Jacint B or the MSTA-B. Or, for instance, there's a lot of self-propelled artillery the Russians could be using, such as the Jacint S or the 2S7 Pion. And then you have a lot of these Russian self-propelled artillery systems that have a max firing range or an effective firing range of between 20 and 25 kilometers. And so, although they're not being utilized now for these strikes on the Pokrovsk logistical area, in due time, you could say, if the Russians continue with these advances northwards that give Avdiivka an additional buffer, they will be moved closer to the line of contact and then will be able to also output their shells in that same direction. And that's not even to mention, for instance, rocket artillery, specifically medium range rocket artillery, because the longer range rocket artillery for the Russians has been working on these more rear, you could say, oriented Ukrainian positions for many months now. But now you could see some of the medium range systems being utilized at a higher frequency. Moving on to the Chasiv Yar front, there are a few minor changes. First of all, south of Ivanivske, we do have a new video showing a Russian armored advance. Not this one. This is actually a video from, I think it was 2 weeks ago, showing the 92nd Assault Brigade Ukrainian units retaking a trench position, and now that same trench position has fallen back into Russian control. There was a Russian advance amounting to about 1.2 kilometers westwards, and this was verified based on geolocations of 2 Russian tanks that were advancing along these open fields and then dismounted the infantry before withdrawing eastwards. And so this is very interesting because now we're seeing the adoption of a lot of these Russian protective cages, not just on the Krasnohorivka front, but also in areas like Chasiv Yar. And so in this video with the 2 tanks, those 2 tanks, they had this protective armor on top of them that is colloquially referred to as a barn just because of its structure, just how bloated it looks from the top. And so it's not even being referred to as a turtle tank in this particular case because the type of design used by the cage is a bit larger in its scale. It's actually being referred to as a barn. And so you could see how the Russian forces, they tried this new innovation out, and it worked to a certain extent around Krasnohorivka to speed up the process of the advances over there and to reduce damage to their vehicles. And now they're trying to do it around Ivanivske. And so I'm sure we're going to see a lot of that going on in areas where the Russian forces want to preserve their equipment and want to get advances with lower casualties. And for the Ukrainian side, the solution to that, it is complicated in the sense that the Ukrainians, their best bets would be to get ATGM crews closer and closer to it to try to target those tanks. but on the other hand, it could be related to artillery. The Ukrainians do need sufficient quantity, but it's not just about quantity, it's also about the quality of those shells, because a lot of the shells that are being launched right now, even if they're newer ones that were recently provided, they're being released from these guns that are already worn off after months or even more of being utilized for these frontline missions, and at that point the accuracy diminishes and you can't really you can't really hit effectively a moving target that already has protection on the top when you have such inaccuracies occurring. And that's all just compounding Ukraine's issues in regards to responding to these armored assaults. But even regardless of that, we do have further north this very interesting information regarding the nature reserve that is located to the south of the Canal micro district. Here's Canal for you guys. This is the eastern suburb of Chasiv Yar. And so we know that the Russian forces were able to reach the basically the pipelines that connect the north and southern parts of the Donbass Canal, and then you could cross over land towards the western side of Chasiv Yar from here. We've known about that, but now you have some Russian sources claiming that the Russians got full control over the forested patch over here, including all of this gray zone marked in the red square. That cannot be verified yet because we don't have any sort of sufficient geolocation, but it does appear the Ukrainians at least withdrew towards their positions located along the high ground on the actual Donbass Canal line on both sides, whether it be east or west. There are fortifications that were built up, especially in the area that splits Chasiv Yar. That's an extremely well-built area, but that's not an area where the Ukrainians have retreated from yet. In any case, the presence of the 98th VDV Division south of Canal District, it is a significant development because now the Russian forces, not only are they taking over the local hills, there's one hill called Mount Baba in this region that the Russian forces have secured, and now they have the opportunity to press from the north and flank the Ukrainian positions that you can see they're not as well built to the south. Of course, there are apartment buildings, but you don't see any sort of trenches on the perimeter. So that is a concern for the Ukrainians that have been defending for a really long time now at the entrance to the Canal District. And now we're seeing that after, I guess you could say, a 2 week cooling period where Ukrainians were able to solidify control of their existing positions and push back the Russians slightly. Now we're seeing the movement of the Russians again within the approaches to the Canal District. And so I talked about it in the last video, but then we got this new video from the Russian side showing KOS-1A shelling of Ukrainian forces within the houses that are located to the northeast of the Canal District. And so that puts into question some of the reports from my last video saying that the Russian forces were located in a similar area. And that's because the Ukrainians released footage showing their drones dropping grenades onto Russian soldiers in the same area. So there may be some sort of back and forth, and we don't have the exact timeline for which video is recorded first. And so for now, that area is still a gray zone. But according to Russian sources that are more so on the ground from the 98th Division, they do claim that they have full control over the forested area to the south of the rail line, which appears to be true. And then they're claiming that Ukrainian reconnaissance forces are still operating heavily within this forested area located to the north of the rail line. And lastly, around Kyslivka, short updates. There's a geolocation from today showing a Russian vehicle as it pushed deeper into the village under artillery cover. So you had heavy Russian shelling of the various houses in the region as that vehicle was advancing and presumably dismounting its forces within the center of the village. And so the Russians are still in the process of clearing it out. There is probably fierce Ukrainian resistance to prevent the collapse of this cluster of villages protecting the eastern approaches to the highway into Kupiansk outskirts, and that may be in part due to the resistance of the 88th Mechanized Brigade in this region and some National Guard units and special purpose units. All in all, the situation has not changed that much around. And lastly, I want to talk about the fact that the Russians, at least on video now, launched their first train from the port of Mariupol to the train station in Volnovakha. So you could see those two localities marked here on the map in Donetsk Oblast. So here we actually have the video, and you can see that the leading flat wagon, it was placed there in order to absorb any sort of damage that could be caused by saboteurs placing mines on the rail line or around it to prevent damage to any sort of equipment that's stored within the other rail carts. And so you could see how it's being transported from Mariupol to Volnovakha in this video. It's the first video of such an event. Okay, so here in the thick yellow color, you could see the rail lines that are currently existing. I marked them, and you can see how the ones that I marked are mainly in Russian-controlled territory, and then some of them extend into the Ukrainian-controlled area. Actually, you could see how they link up in Pokrovsk, a lot of these rail lines that come from Zaporozhye and Donetsk. But anyhow, what you see here is that really the amount of time and the distance that has to be covered for any sort of supplies to come in from Taganrog and from Rostov-on-Don into an area like Donetsk or even deeper into Zaporozhye or Kherson, it does take a long time, and that's the rationale behind the Russian forces embarking upon new construction operations to shorten the amount of time that it takes to actually move such key equipment to the front line. And the reason why it takes so long is because you have this massive loop over here, which does then stop in Donetsk, of course, and then you go south, and then you stop in Volnovakha, and then you could go west, or you could go south to Mariupol. And so what that video I showed you, that actually shows the Russian forces sending in the first rail carts from the Mariupol facilities further north to Volnovakha. And so that's an already existing rail line that the Ukrainians used before the war. But recently, in the past few months, based on satellite imagery, especially since January of this year, it's become a very active part of the Russian logistical services. And so now a lot of equipment that's originally stopped in Mariupol is then being moved up to the line of contact via Volnovakha, and then from there dispersed to wherever it is needed. What we haven't seen yet is connection between Volnovakha and Donetsk, because you have this parts of the rail line that was not intact, it was not active due to the conflict and due to how close it is to the front line. And the Russians are now in the process of restoring it. And so I will be keeping an eye out to see if the Russian forces do finish that process and do begin using this rail line to very quickly connect between Mariupol to Donetsk directly through that road. Another thing that's happened that I haven't updated yet is the fact that the Russian forces constructed like another 60 kilometers of rail line that basically circumvents the loop that I talked about earlier and directly reaches from Taganrog to Mariupol in a faster manner. And so you could see that line built here in this blue color. I mapped this out about 7 months ago, I think. And since then, the Russian forces have completed this span of rail line, and it's now being utilized by the Russian logistics services. And so you can see it's about 58 kilometers of new rail line that the Russian forces are using, and that speeds up the process of transporting from Russia proper to key parts of Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. In addition, the Russian forces are trying to reduce the distances and the tolls and all of that by building rail line directly from Mariupol to Berdyansk and then from there towards Melitopol. All in all, this would mean that Russia's dependence on the Kerch Bridge is greatly diminished, and it also means that any sort of Ukrainian attack strike, which is being planned on that facility, is going to have much less of an impact than it would have if they were able to successfully destroy it or take it off for a very long period of time like they actually did about like a year and a half ago. At this point, of course, it would still have a certain damage due to the rail line that runs along the Kerch Strait. That is, of course, true. But the Russian forces since then have definitely diversified their options for basically sending in equipment to the line of contact. And a lot of it is being done from Russia proper and along this land bridge. So as the Russian forces continue to build up their rail infrastructure, whether it be new rail depots, new stations, opening up different bridges, I will be very interested to see how the Ukrainians respond to that, whether they still do maintain a fixation on the Kerch Bridge or whether they focus shorter range strikes, and that could still be from the ATACMS, maybe from a shorter range one like the cluster M39s trying to target any sort of new rail infrastructure. I'm very interested to see what they do with that and if they're actually able to damage any sort of extent of the Russian rail over here. It's just that there are so many different structures, and targeting the rail line itself would not really cause much damage in the long term. It could be easily repaired. And so the main targets, if the Ukrainians were to go for that, would be to hit at the heart of the actual large rail stations, whether they be at Mariupol, Volnovakha, perhaps these other cities like Melitopol, Berdyansk, but not the actual rail lines. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.